Breaking news with Weeb Union, the Russians are storming Vuhledar from 3 directions, from the east, west, and south. The Russians have managed to capture the Dacha area of Vuhledar, and they've also storming several other areas, key areas for Vuhledar. Every single supply line is being stormed of the Ukrainians. They have 2 supply lines that they use currently, one going through the western parts to the north, and one through the eastern parts again to the north. Both of these supply lines are being stormed by Russian forces, both from the eastern and western sides. The Russians have here managed to cross over the river line, where they are storming Ukrainian fortified positions. At the same time, they are expanding their zone of control in the eastern direction. The objective is to gain control over the fortified areas of the Ukrainians and gain full control over the supply line going through the western parts of Vuhledar. Directly to the south, the Russians are storming directly towards Vuhledar, across the river line near Pavlivka, cutting off the road from the southern direction and attacking Vuhledar itself. In the eastern direction, the Russians stormed through the main road towards the Dacha area, gaining full control over the Dacha area and the fortified positions, and followed it up with an assault from the south as well. Most of these updates were reported by Deep State Map and corroborated by Syriac Map, so it is confirmed information. At the same time, the Russians also storming the supply road to the northeast. This means one of 2 things will take place in the coming few hours. Either the Ukrainians will launch a counterattack to try and stabilize the situation, or they will either surrender or withdraw from the town. This means that we are on the very decisive moment and really the most critical seconds and minutes and hours of the Battle of Vuhledar since the very start of it in 2022 until now is right now. The Russians may take the city today, tonight, this morning. As we see, the situation is extremely critical for the Ukrainians as the Russians are storming from 3 separate directions and are within just a few kilometers of the final lifeline of Vuhledar. This means that the positions of the Ukrainians in this entire section of the front line between Konstantinivka and the south, to the east of Velika Novosilka, which is hardly fortified, and there's actually a clear road towards Andreevka and Konstantinopel, here to the west of Korokhove, flanking the Ukrainian positions in this entire area if the Russians capture Vuhledar, not to mention the natural fortress of Vuhledar, surrounded with a river to the south, the high ground located within the town itself, the apartment complex buildings, and the open fields in the area will all be lost to this Russian offensive. So the situation right now is extremely critical for Ukraine in this section of the front line, and the Russians really are pulling off a massive offensive towards Vuhledar from 3 separate directions. This shows 2 things. The first thing is that it is very clear the Russians have learned a lot from their failures, and by removing the general that really didn't know how to think with one who knows how to think, the situation has completely changed, and the Ukrainians spreading their forces too thinly across the front has allowed the Russians to rapidly develop the section of the front line, and it is currently collapsing. And this is to everyone who keeps saying, I keep saying that the front is collapsing, but we see no evidence of it. Well, this is some of the evidence of the front line collapsing for Ukraine. Further north in the direction of Ukrainsk, the Russians have expanded southwest of the town, where they've managed to capture a fortified position and a couple of fields towards the final fortified positions of the Ukrainians in between Ukrainsk in the south and Novorodivka in the north. They've also managed to capture the mine here to the west of Ukrainsk. This leads to the Russians gaining a foothold in the railways connected between Pokrovsk and Korokhove. This means that the Russians can start operating in the southern flank of Selidove to flank the town and towards Korokhove towards the south. We'll see rapid developments here as well, although not really as significant and much smaller in scale. In the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to capture the waste heap here in the central parts, where we see now that the Russians have gained control over the final high ground hill here in the direction of Toretsk, and with control over half of the high-rise apartment complex area, the Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk are also rapidly deteriorating. We see that with the breakthrough by the Russians towards Leonidivka, where there's no reports of the Ukrainians clearing this area, so we have to wait until further news on whether or not the Russians will be able to hold on to that. and whether or not the Russians will develop their offensive operations further here in the southern flank of Toretsk. But we're definitely seeing some progress here within the central parts of Toretsk. With the fall of the high ground for the Ukrainians, the Russians can now move in to clear the forest area and connect the two sides to gain full control over the eastern parts of Toretsk. Further north, we see that the Ukrainians launched a small counterattack in the direction of Sesnyansky, recapturing some of the positions the Russians captured earlier this month. Further north in the direction of Nevsky, the Russians have managed to capture the whole entire area between Nevsky and Makiivka following a Ukrainian withdrawal. The Ukrainians first attempted to counterattack once the Russians got a foothold within Nevsky, but the Russian attack was too powerful. They managed to destroy the Ukrainian counterattack, and the remaining Ukrainian soldiers decided to withdraw across the Serbets River line. This led to the Russians gaining full control over the area in between the two towns, and now the Russian positions here on the eastern bank of the Serbets River line is much more powerful, and they may launch further offensive operations in the direction of the next village chain here on the eastern bank of the Serbets River line. It seems that the situation is rapidly developing across the front line, not just in the Vuhledar section, but across multiple sectors. In the direction of Pishana, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack. With this geolocated footage here, we see that the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians back, land some troops with an IFV, and regain control over this forest line. So we see that the Ukrainians are not giving up the battle here west of Pishana. They've shown multiple counterattacks both in the direction of Tabeivka and now in the direction of the Oskar River line. However, in the direction of Tabeivka, the Russians managed to recapture the lost positions and push the Ukrainians even further back. So we may see the similar situation happening here, but we'll see as time will tell. Generally, across the front line, the Russians are developing their offensive operations, and they are capturing more territory by the day, sometimes even by the hour. There's no reports on the updates near Kursk as heavy fighting is taking place, and generally we're seeing a lot of operational security and secrecy from both sides over the past few weeks. Usually there was a lot more posts about advances and a lot more reports from Russian and Ukrainian soldiers about what they were doing, a lot more geolocated footage, but now it is a lot more secret. I believe that this is mainly due to the fact that active operations are taking place by both sides. The Ukrainians sprung their Kursk offensive out of nowhere, and following that the Russians just doubled down on their offensive operations in the Donetsk region. We saw the Battle of Vuhledar coming from miles away. I don't really believe, though, that anyone really expected the Russians to yet again storm the town head-on, and not only that, but meet with this much success, attacking it from 3 separate directions and gaining success in every single one of them. The Russians have also become much riskier, like the case here between Toretsk and Neolidivka. The Russians driving through heavy fire to reach this point, drop off its soldiers, and actually succeed is a whole thing in and of itself, but the fact that they even attempted it shows that they have become much more courageous, or they simply have lifted the limit on what sort of operations the soldiers will undergo. The Russians are now attempting to push from the residential area in the southern parts of Toretsk towards Leonidivka to cut off the Ukrainian positions within this pocket, and as a result of that, the Ukrainians are starting a withdrawal. The 12th Azov Brigade is facing defeat in the Nelipivka direction. What was originally an objective to free up Ukrainian soldiers stuck in the aggregate plant in the central parts of New York ended up being an operation where they have to save themselves from encirclement. So we see that the situation is simply too much for the Ukrainian army to handle, and this points towards the Russians likely trying to take as much of an advantage as possible of the situation right now, as the Ukrainians are suffering from overextension, lack of manpower, resources, and so on. And at the same time, the Russians have upgraded their FAB bombs, where reports are now coming that the Russians are hitting the central parts of Zaporizhia with FAB 500s, despite the range between the central parts of Zaporizhia down to the areas close to the front line. This is approximately the range of the FAB bombs. This means either the Ukrainian air defense has been completely destroyed in the area and cannot shoot Russian jets even this close to the front line, or that the Russians have increased the range of their FAB bombs. At the same time, we also see that there were reports and video footage of the Russians destroying Patriot systems here south of Dnipro, and with the range of the Patriot system, it would range somewhere around here. That means if the air defense systems here in the south were destroyed in the Dnipro direction, then it makes sense that the Russians can fly closer and launch FAB bombs into Zaporizhia. But how is this significant? It is significant in the fact that now the Russians doesn't need to use high range, high accuracy, expensive rockets to hit targets in Zaporizhia. They can now use inexpensive, cheap FAB 500 bombs to hit with the same firepower, and that will have much more devastating effects on the city and generally the southern section of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.